The restaurant smelled like expensive wine and fresh flowers. The kind of place where every fork had its own specific purpose, and the napkins were folded into little swans. Isabella Chin had memorized every corner of the Riverside Garden over the past 3 years. She knew which floorboard creaked near table 7, which light fixture flickered when it rained, and exactly how Mr. Thompson liked his coffee 2 sugars. Cream on the side, never mixed in. At 28 years old, Isabella had become invisible. Not literally, of course. People saw her when they needed something. A water refill. Extra bread. The check, please. And could you hurry? But they didn't really see her. Not the way they saw each other when they laughed over appetizers or clinked champagne glasses to celebrate promotions. She was part of the background, like the soft lighting or the quiet jazz that played through hidden speakers. She didn't mind most days. The work was honest, and the tips were decent enough to cover rent on her tiny studio apartment across town. The restaurant attracted a certain crowd: lawyers celebrating wins, families marking anniversaries, business people closing deals over $40 steaks. They dressed in clothes that cost more than Isabella made in a week. And they never looked twice at the girl in the black apron who made sure their evening went smoothly. The other servers were kind enough. There was Miguel, who had worked there for a decade and knew everyone's life story. Rita, a college student saving up for medical school, always stressed but always smiling. And old Thomas, who'd been in the restaurant business so long he could predict exactly when a table would ask for the manager. They formed a quiet team, moving around each other with practiced efficiency, speaking in half-sentences that only they understood. But even among them, Isabella kept to herself. During breaks, while the others scrolled through their phones or shared stories about their weekends, she would slip outside to the small patio behind the kitchen. She'd sit on the old wooden bench, close her eyes, and listen to the sounds of the city. Sometimes she'd hum quietly to herself, melodies that lived somewhere deep in her chest, waiting for a moment to breathe. The restaurant had a piano, a beautiful grand piano that sat in the corner of the main dining room like a piece of art. Every Friday and Saturday night, they hired a pianist to play during dinner service. Usually it was Mr. Peterson, a retired music teacher with gentle hands and a repertoire of classical pieces that never offended anyone. Sometimes it was the younger guy, Vincent, who played with more flair but less reliability. The piano was always perfectly tuned, its black surface polished until you could see your reflection in it. Isabella would watch it sometimes when she thought no one was paying attention. Between taking orders and delivering plates, her eyes would drift toward that corner. She'd see the pianist's fingers moving across the keys and feel something twist inside her chest. A longing. A memory. A life that existed in another universe where different choices had been made. She had been 7 when her mother first took her to piano lessons. Mrs. Rodriguez, their neighbor in the cramped apartment building, had an old upright piano she was willing to teach on for practically nothing. Isabella's mother worked 2 jobs back then, cleaning offices at night and working the morning shift at a laundromat, but she'd insisted. Music makes you rich in ways money can't, she'd said, even as they counted pennies for groceries. And Isabella had loved it. Truly loved it in a way that made everything else fade away. By 12, she was the best student Mrs. Rodriguez had ever taught. By 15, she'd won a regional competition and caught the attention of the prestigious Hartwell Music Academy. They'd offered her a scholarship, not a full one, but enough that with some loans and her mother's savings, they could make it work. That was the plan. Isabella would study music, become a concert pianist, maybe teach at a university someday. She'd practice 6 hours a day during her senior year of high school, her fingers flying across Mrs. Rodriguez's old piano until the keys felt like extensions of her own body. She'd been accepted. Everything was arranged. Her future was a clear, bright path. Then her mother got sick. It started with fatigue that wouldn't go away. Then the diagnosis: cancer, aggressive, requiring immediate treatment. The savings disappeared first, swallowed by medical bills and medications not covered by their bare-bones insurance. Then came the hard choice. The scholarship had a deadline. The academy couldn't hold her spot indefinitely, and her mother needed someone there, someone to drive her to appointments, to hold her hand during the bad nights, to keep the household running when the chemotherapy left her too weak to stand. Isabella made the choice without really thinking about it. Of course she'd stay. Of course she'd defer her dreams. What kind of daughter would abandon her mother when she needed her most? She'd found work at a diner, then later at the Riverside Garden when they were hiring. The pay was better, and the flexible schedule meant she could be there for her mother. Her mother had survived. Thank God. 3 years of treatment, and she was in remission now. Living with Isabella's aunt in Arizona, where the dry air was easier on her lungs. She called Isabella every Sunday, always asking the same question, "When are you going back to music, Mia?" And Isabella always gave the same known answer. "Soon, Mom, soon." But soon had a way of never arriving. The bills from her mother's illness still needed paying. The academy had moved on, filled her scholarship slot with another talented kid who hadn't missed their window. And somewhere along the way, Isabella had convinced herself that the dream was over. She was 28 now, not 18. The world didn't wait for people who took detours, so she worked her shifts at the Riverside Garden, smiled politely at customers who barely saw her, and tried not to look at the piano too long. It hurt less that way. On Thursday afternoons, the restaurant was closed for private events or deep cleaning. Isabella would sometimes arrive early, before Miguel or Rita or anyone else showed up. The owner, Mr. Langley, didn't mind he appreciated employees who were reliable. She'd let herself in through the back door, flip on just enough lights to see, and walk through the empty dining room. And sometimes, when she was absolutely certain she was alone, she would sit at the piano just for a moment, just to remember what it felt like. Her fingers would rest on the keys, and for those few seconds, she wasn't a waitress. She wasn't invisible. She was the girl who'd won competitions, who'd made Mrs. Rodriguez cry with pride, who dreamed of playing in concert halls, but she never pressed down, never made a sound, because once she started, she wasn't sure she'd be able to stop. And this wasn't her piano. This wasn't her life. This was just the place where she worked, where she was part of the scenery, where no one paid attention to the quiet girl who refilled their water glasses and cleared their plates, at least. That's what she thought. She had no idea that everything was about to change. That one unexpected Saturday night would crack open the door she'd closed on her dreams. That sometimes the universe has a funny way of refusing to let talent stay. It's hidden forever. But that Saturday was still 2 days away. For now, Isabella was just the waitress nobody noticed, moving through the Riverside Garden like a ghost, carrying other people's celebrations on her tray, while her own music stayed locked inside her chest. Waiting for permission to be heard, Saturday arrived with the kind of energy that made every server at the Riverside Garden a little nervous. The reservation book was completely full, and not just with regular diners. Tonight was special. Richard Hartwell, a prominent local businessman who owned half the real estate downtown, was throwing his retirement party at the restaurant. 50 guests, premium menu, open bar, and he'd specifically requested the best of everything. Isabella had arrived for her shift at 4 p.m, 2 hours before service began. The dining room was already being transformed. Extra flowers on every table. The good china instead of the regular plates. Mr. Langley himself was there. Something that rarely happened on regular nights, directing the staff with unusual intensity. "Everything needs to be perfect tonight," he kept saying. Hartwell tips well, but more importantly, he talks. If this goes well, we'll see a lot more business from his circle. The pressure trickled down to everyone. Miguel was moving faster than usual, his jokes less frequent. Rita looked like she might throw up from stress. Even old Thomas seemed tense as he folded napkins with extra precision. Isabella tried to focus on her section tables, 12 through 17, and mentally prepared herself for a long, exhausting night. Vincent was scheduled to play piano tonight. He was younger than Mr. Peterson, maybe in his mid-30s, and he played with more energy. More show. He was the kind of pianist who swayed with the music, and occasionally threw in a flourish that wasn't in the original composition. The regular customers either loved him or found him pretentious. There was no in-between. The guests began arriving at 6. Isabella watched as they filed in, dressed in suits and evening gowns that probably cost more than her yearly salary. They carried themselves with the easy confidence of people who never worried about making rent or choosing between groceries and gas money. Richard Hartwell stood near the entrance, greeting everyone with firm handshakes and genuine smiles. He was older, maybe in his early 60s, with gray hair and laugh lines around his eyes. Despite his wealth, he seemed kind, approachable even. Service began smoothly. Isabella fell into her rhythm, taking orders, delivering drinks, making sure bread baskets stayed full. The kitchen was running efficiently, and the food was coming out beautifully. Mr. Langley actually smiled at one point, a rare sight that meant things were going according to plan. Vincent was supposed to arrive at 7 to begin playing at 7:30. 7 o'clock came and went. No Vincent. Mr. Langley kept glancing at his watch. Then at the empty piano bench, his smile fading into a tight line of concern. By 7:15, he stepped outside to make a phone call. And Isabella could see through the window that his face was getting red the way it did when he was trying very hard not to yell. At 7:30, Vincent finally arrived. Isabella was passing by the entrance with a tray of appetizers when she saw him stumble through the door. His shirt was wrinkled, his tie loose, and even from several feet away, she could smell the alcohol on him. Her stomach dropped. This wasn't going to end well. Mr. Langley intercepted him immediately, speaking in a low, urgent voice. Vincent waved him off with exaggerated gestures, saying something about traffic and a friend's emergency, his words slurring together. A few guests near the entrance were starting to notice, their conversations pausing as they glanced toward the commotion. "Just let me play," Vincent said, loud enough now that more heads turned. "I'm fine. I'm a professional." He wasn't fine. Isabella watched as he made his way to the piano, bumping into a chair and nearly knocking over someone's wine glass. He sat down heavily on the bench, adjusted his position twice, and then launched into what was supposed to be a Chopin nocturne. The first few notes were passable, but then his fingers fumbled. He started over. Fumbled again. The third time, he managed to get through. About 30 seconds before his hands completely lost coordination with each other, the dining room had gone quiet in that uncomfortable way where everyone pretends they're not watching a disaster unfold. Vincent seemed oblivious, starting yet another piece, this one even worse than the last. Isabella stood frozen near the kitchen door, her tray forgotten. Watching as Mr. Langley's entire evening fell apart, Richard Hartwell stood up from his table. For a moment, Isabella thought he might leave, might gather his guests and walk out, leaving the restaurant's reputation in ruins. Instead, he approached the piano calmly and put a gentle hand on Vincent's shoulder. "Maybe you should take a break," he said quietly. Vincent spun around, nearly falling off the bench. "I don't need a break. I'm playing." His voice carried across the entire restaurant now. Several guests looked away in embarrassment. Mr. Langley was moving toward them, his face pale. "You're drunk," Hartwell said, still calm but firm. "And you're disrupting my party? I think it's time for you to go." What happened next happened fast. Vincent stood up abruptly, said something insulting that Isabella couldn't quite hear, and then loudly declared that the restaurant didn't appreciate real artistry anyway. Mr. Langley tried to intervene, but Vincent shoved past him, knocking over a music stand in the process, and stormed toward the exit. The door slammed behind him with enough force that the windows rattled. Silence filled the riverside garden. Horrible, suffocating silence that felt like it lasted hours but was probably only seconds. Isabella could see Mr. Langley standing there, his face cycling through emotions, embarrassment, panic. The piano sat empty in the corner, a reminder of what should have been happening but wasn't. Hartwell returned to his table and said something to his guests that made a few of them laugh, trying to salvage the mood. Other conversations slowly started up again, but they were forced, artificial. The comfortable atmosphere from earlier had evaporated. This was supposed to be a perfect evening. And now, it was the night when the pianist showed up drunk and caused a scene. Isabella watched as Mr. Langley pulled out his phone, his fingers shaking slightly as he scrolled through contacts. He was calling other pianists, she realized, trying to find someone, anyone who could fill in. She moved closer, pretending to adjust a table setting while listening to his increasingly desperate conversations. I know it's Saturday night. Yes, I understand you're already booked. Please, if you know anyone. No. Okay, thank you anyway. Call after call. The same result. Every pianist in the city was already working. It was Saturday night. The busiest night of the week. No one kept their schedule open on Saturday night. Isabella's heart was pounding. Her hands were sweating. She set down her tray on an empty table because she was afraid she might drop it. There was a voice in her head, growing louder with each failed phone call Mr. Langley made. A voice that said she could help, that she should help, that maybe this was the moment she'd been waiting for, without knowing she was waiting. But fear is a powerful thing. It had kept her quiet for 3 years, kept her from touching the piano keys when the restaurant was empty, kept her from even mentioning to her coworkers that she'd once been good enough for the Hartwell Music Academy. Fear of failure, fear of being seen, fear of hoping for something and having it ripped away again. Mr. Langley ended another call and pressed his palms against his eyes. He looked older suddenly, tired. This wasn't just about tonight. This was about reputation, about future business, about everything he'd built. Isabella thought about her mother in Arizona, who called every Sunday and asked when she'd go back to music. She thought about Mrs. Rodriguez, her first teacher, who'd believed in her so completely. She thought about 18-year-old Isabella, who'd practiced until her fingers hurt because she loved it that much. She took a step forward. Then another. Her legs felt shaky, like they belonged to someone else. Mr. Langley? He looked up, clearly surprised to be interrupted. Not now, Isabella. I can play piano. The words came out quieter than she'd intended, but they came out. She watched his expression change from confusion to disbelief, to something that might have been hope or might have been desperation. In that moment, she couldn't tell the difference. What? I can play the piano, she said again, louder this time. I studied for years. I was good. I am good. I think. I could try, at least, if you want. Mr. Langley stared at her like she'd suddenly sprouted wings. In 3 years of working at the Riverside Garden, Isabella had been the quiet one, the reliable one who never called in sick and never caused problems. He probably didn't know a single personal thing about her beyond her name and schedule. You're serious? Yes. He glanced at the piano, then at his guests, then back at Isabella. She could see him doing the math in his head. The party was already damaged. Could letting a waitress play piano make it worse? Or did he have nothing left to lose? Okay, he said finally. Okay, yes, please. Isabella's hands trembled as she reached behind her back and untied her apron. The simple act of removing it felt monumental, like she was shedding a skin she'd worn for too long. Miguel appeared beside her, his eyes wide. Isabella? What are you doing? Something crazy, she whispered. Maybe something right. I'm not sure yet. She folded the apron carefully and handed it to him. Then, before she could change her mind, before fear could pull her back into invisibility, Isabella Chen walked across the Riverside Garden toward the grand piano in the corner. And with every step, she felt 50 pairs of eyes following her. Wondering who this girl thought she was, the walk to the piano felt like crossing an ocean. Isabella was aware of everything, the soft rustle of her server's uniform, the curious whispers starting to spread through the dining room, the weight of every gaze following her movement. Rita stood frozen near table 9, a water pitcher halfway to a glass. Miguel still held her apron, his mouth slightly open in shock. Even the kitchen staff had poked their heads out to see what was happening. Richard Hartwell watched her with interest, his head tilted slightly to one side. His guests, who'd been trying to resume their conversations after Vincent's dramatic exit, went quiet again. A woman in a silver dress leaned toward her husband and murmured something. A younger man in the corner actually took out his phone, probably ready to record whatever happened next, whether that would be entertainment or embarrassment. Nobody knew yet. Isabella reached the piano and stood beside it for a moment, her hand resting on its smooth, polished surface. The wood was cool beneath her palm, real, solid. She'd walked past this instrument thousands of times over 3 years, had dusted it carefully during slow shifts, had watched countless pianists sit here and play. But she'd never actually sat on this bench herself. Not officially. Not when people were watching. Her breath was coming fast now, her heart hammering against her ribs like it was trying to escape. What was she doing? She was a waitress. Just a waitress. She cleared tables and took orders and tried not to bother anyone. Who did she think she was, believing she could play for these people? It had been years since she'd performed for an audience. Years since she'd played anything more challenging than the simple melodies she hummed to herself on break, but there was no turning back now. Not with everyone watching. Not with Mr. Langley's desperate hope hanging in the air. Not with that voice in her head, the one that sounded like her mother, like Mrs. Rodriguez, like her own younger self saying, "You can do this. You were meant to do this." She sat down on the bench. The leather was worn in certain spots, shaped by the bodies of pianists who'd come before her. She adjusted her position, pulled the bench forward slightly, then paused. Her hands hovered over the keys like birds, uncertain about landing. The restaurant was so quiet she could hear the clock on the far wall ticking. Someone coughed. A glass clinked against a plate. Simple sounds that felt enormous in the silence. Isabella closed her eyes. If she was going to fail, if she was going to make a fool of herself, at least she wouldn't have to watch it happen. In the darkness behind her eyelids, memories surfaced. She was 7 again, at Mrs. Rodriguez's apartment, learning where to place her fingers. She was 12, winning her first competition, her mother in the front row crying happy tears. She was 15, getting the acceptance letter from Hartwell Academy, running through the hallway screaming with joy. She was 18, sitting in a hospital waiting room, choosing between her dreams and her mother's life. Knowing she'd make the same choice 1,000 times over, but feeling something inside her break anyway, all of it led here. To this moment, to this piano, to these people who didn't know her, who'd never seen her as anything more than the girl who brought their food. Isabella took one deep breath, then let her fingers drop to the keys. The first note of Debussy's Clair de Lune bloomed into the restaurant like a flower opening, soft, tentative, almost questioning. Her right hand found the melody while her left hand provided the gentle foundation beneath it. The piece was like moonlight on water, delicate and dreamlike, and she'd played it so many times in her life that her fingers remembered even when her mind was flooded with fear. For the first few measures, her playing was careful, restrained. She was feeling her way back into something she'd abandoned, testing whether the connection was still there. The keys felt familiar, but also strange, like meeting an old friend after years apart and realizing you'd both changed. Her hands were slightly stiff from years of carrying trays instead of practicing scales. There was a tiny hesitation between phrases that a trained ear might catch. But then something shifted, maybe. It was muscle memory kicking in fully. Maybe it was the realization that she was actually doing it, actually playing, and the world hadn't ended. Maybe it was simply that the music had been locked inside her for so long that once released, it refused to be contained. Whatever the reason, Isabella felt herself relax into the piece. Her shoulders dropped. Her breathing steadied. The notes began to flow instead of stumble. The conversations in the restaurant hadn't stopped immediately. In fact, when she'd first started playing, many guests had kept talking, their voices creating a buzz of background noise. But gradually, sentence by sentence, voice by voice, the talking faded. It happened so naturally that Isabella almost didn't notice at first. A man at table 4 stopped mid-word, his fork pausing halfway to his mouth. A woman near the window set down her wine glass and turned her chair slightly toward the piano. Richard Hartwell leaned back in his seat, his arms crossed, but his expression had changed from curious to attentive. Isabella's eyes were still closed, but she could feel the shift in the room's energy. She could sense people beginning to listen, really listen, instead of just having music play in the background. The awareness should have made her nervous, should have sent fear shooting through her again. Instead, it felt like permission, like an invitation to show them what she could really do. She transitioned from Clair de Lune into Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, another piece that lived in her bones. This one was more emotional, more dramatic. The melody sang out clear and pure, spinning threads of sound that seemed to wrap around the room. Her left hand provided rich, rolling chords, while her right hand danced through the ornamentation. There was a section in the middle where the piece swelled with passion, and Isabella leaned into it, her whole body moving with the music now. That's when she heard it. The distinct sound of silverware being set down, the scrape of chairs as people adjusted to face her direction, the complete and total silence of 50 people who'd stopped eating, stopped talking, stopped everything except listening. Isabella opened her eyes. The sight that greeted her was so unexpected that she nearly stumbled over the next measure. Every single person in the restaurant was looking at her, not just glancing in her direction while they finished a conversation or took another bite of food. Actually watching her, focused on her, seeing her. Miguel stood against the wall near the kitchen, his hand pressed to his mouth, his eyes shiny. Rita had set down her water pitcher on an empty table, seemingly forgetting about it entirely. Mr. Langley was near the entrance, and even in the dim lighting, Isabella could see the shock on his face. He'd taken a chance on her out of desperation, expecting competent background music at best. This was clearly not what he'd anticipated, but it was the guests' faces that caught Isabella's attention most. The woman in the silver dress had tears on her cheeks. An older gentleman near the center of the room sat perfectly still, transported somewhere else by the music. A young couple held hands across their table, staring at each other with the kind of look that suggested the piano was playing exactly what they were feeling but couldn't express. And Richard Hartwell, the man whose retirement party this was supposed to be, watched Isabella with an intensity that made her feel truly seen for the first time in years. She should have been terrified. She was just a waitress playing piano in the restaurant where she worked. It's probably violating some unspoken rule about servers staying in their lane. But instead, sitting at that piano with all those eyes on her, Isabella felt something she hadn't felt since she was 18 years old. She felt like herself, her real self, the self she'd hidden away to survive, but never actually lost. The fear that had defined her life for the past decade began to crack. Not disappear, fear doesn't work that way, but crack enough to let light through, because she was doing it. She was playing, and it was working. More than working, she was reaching people, moving them, reminding them of something beautiful in a world that often forgot beauty existed. Chopin melted into Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, the first movement slow and haunting. Then she surprised herself by transitioning into Imagine by John Lennon, reimagined as a classical piece with delicate arpeggios and careful dynamics. She hadn't planned any of this. She was just playing what felt right, following an instinct that had been dormant but never dead. A server from another section, Carlos, who'd always been friendly but distant, stood near his tables with his hands clasped together, nodding slightly with the rhythm. The line cooks had abandoned their stations to cluster near the kitchen door, listening. Even the dishwasher, whose name Isabella had never learned, peeked around the corner, his arms still dripping with soapy water. Time became strange. Isabella wasn't sure if she'd been playing for 5 minutes or 50. The only thing that existed was the music, her hands on the keys, and the connection forming between her and everyone in that room. It was the thing she'd loved most about performing when she was younger. The sense that music could create a shared experience, could make a room full of strangers feel something together. Her fingers knew what to do, even when her conscious mind didn't. They found runs and trills, built crescendos and pulled back into whispers, told stories without words. This was what she'd given up. This was what she'd locked away in a box labeled Old Dreams and tried to forget. But dreams don't die just because you stop feeding them. They wait. They hibernate. They hold their breath until the moment you're finally ready to let them live again. And, as Isabella played, as the restaurant transformed from a place of business into a place of art, she realized something profound. She'd thought being invisible had kept her safe, but actually, it had been slowly erasing her. Piece by piece, shift by shift, she'd been disappearing into a life that wasn't really hers. And now, finally, terrifyingly, hopefully, she was coming back. Isabella didn't plan to play for 25 minutes straight. She didn't consciously decide to pour every ounce of longing. Regret, hope, and passion she'd been carrying for the past decade into the keys beneath her fingers. But that's exactly what happened. The music moved through her like a river that had been dammed up for too long. And once the floodgates opened, there was no stopping it. She moved from piece to piece with a natural flow, each one connected by threads of emotion rather than formal structure. After Imagine, she found herself playing Ludovico Einaudí's Nouvelle Bianche, a contemporary piece that built slowly from simple repetition into something powerful and overwhelming. The melody was hypnotic, the kind that got under your skin and stayed there. Her hands moved with increasing confidence now, no longer questioning whether they remembered, but trusting completely that they did. The restaurant had become something else entirely. People had stopped pretending to be there for dinner. Forks rested beside untouched food. Wine glasses sat full, forgotten. This was no longer Richard Hartwell's retirement party. It was an impromptu concert, and every person in the room had become an audience member by accident. Isabella could see faces more clearly now that her eyes were open. The woman in the silver dress wasn't even trying to hide her tears anymore. They streamed down her face freely, and the man beside her, her husband, probably had his arm around her shoulders, his own eyes red. Near the window, a younger woman had pulled out her phone, but not to scroll mindlessly. She held it against her chest, her other hand covering her mouth. Visibly moved by what she was hearing, an older gentleman, maybe in his 70s, sat alone at a corner table. His hands were folded in his lap. He stared at Isabella with an expression of such profound sadness mixed with joy that it made her throat tight. She wondered what memory the music was unlocking for him. A lost love, a missed opportunity, a version of himself he'd left behind years ago. Everyone carries something. Everyone has a story that certain songs can crack open. Miguel had tears running down his face now too, not bothering to wipe them away. Rita had sunk into a chair at an empty table, her usual stress completely gone, replaced by something like wonder. Carlos, the other server, stood with his arms crossed, but his face was soft in a way Isabella had never seen before. These were her co-workers, people she'd worked alongside for years in Pleasant. But distant coexistence, and they were looking at her like she was a completely different person. Or maybe like they were finally seeing the person who'd been there all along. Mr. Langley had moved closer to the piano, positioning himself where he could see both Isabella and his guests. His earlier panic had been replaced by something Isabella couldn't quite read. Amazement, certainly, but also maybe regret. Like he was realizing he'd employed someone for 3 years without having any idea who she actually was. The waitress who never called in sick and always smiled politely had entire worlds inside her that he'd never thought to ask about. Richard. Hartwell remained the most composed person in the room, but even he had leaned forward in his seat, his full attention on Isabella. Unlike the others who seemed lost in their own emotional responses, he was studying her, analyzing. There was a sharpness to his gaze that suggested he was someone who recognized talent when he saw it, and understood its value. Isabella transitioned into her final piece without fully deciding to. Her hands moved into the opening notes of Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor. One of the most technically demanding pieces she knew. It was a risk. She hadn't played it in years, and Rachmaninoff required not just emotion but precision. But something in her had shifted. The girl who'd been afraid to be seen had left the building. In her place was the pianist she'd once been and could be again. The piece opened with heavy, dramatic chords that filled the entire restaurant. Dark, powerful, almost ominous. Her hands moved across the keys with authority now, no trace of hesitation remaining. The middle section lightened, became more delicate and questioning, before building back toward another dramatic crescendo. It was a piece that demanded everything from the player: technical skill, emotional depth, physical stamina, and Isabella gave it everything she had. Sweat had formed on her forehead. Her arms were beginning to ache in that good way that comes from using muscles you've neglected. Her heart raced, not from fear anymore, but from the pure exhilaration of performing at the edge of her abilities. This was what it meant to be fully alive. Not safe, not invisible, but present and real and undeniably there, The final chords of the Rachmaninoff rang out into the restaurant, powerful and definitive. Isabella held her hands on the keys for a moment after the last note faded, letting the silence settle. Her chest heaved with the effort of what she'd just done. Her whole body hummed with energy. And then slowly, she lifted her hands and placed them in her lap. For 3 long seconds, nothing happened. The restaurant remained perfectly silent. 50 people sat frozen, as if waking from a shared dream and not quite ready to return to reality. Isabella's stomach dropped. Had she misjudged? Had she played too long? Been too bold? Maybe they'd been polite during the performance, but now were horrified that the waitress had disrupted their evening so completely. Then Richard Hartwell stood up. He began to clap, his hands coming together in strong, deliberate strikes that echoed through the quiet room. And like a dam breaking, everyone else stood too. The entire restaurant rose to their feet in a wave, and suddenly the silence was shattered by applause. Not polite golf claps. Real applause. Enthusiastic, sustained, thunderous applause. The woman in the silver dress was clapping while still crying, laughing at herself even as she wiped at her face. The older gentleman in the corner stood with difficulty, using his cane for support, but he stood and clapped with shaky hands. The young couple near the window whistled and cheered. Someone shouted "Brava!" in an accent that suggested they actually knew classical music. The phone that several people had pulled out were being used to record now, capturing this moment that no one had expected. Isabella sat at the piano bench, stunned. Completely and utterly stunned. Her hands trembled as she brought them to her face. The applause continued, showing no signs of stopping. More people were standing now, not just the guests, but the entire staff. Miguel was clapping so hard it had to hurt. Rita was bouncing on her toes, grinning wider than Isabella had ever seen. The kitchen staff had emerged fully from the back, adding their voices to the celebration. Even Mr. Langley was clapping, though his expression suggested he was still processing what had just happened. Isabella stood on shaky legs and did something she'd learned years ago in her competition days. She took a small bow. Just a slight incline of her head and upper body, acknowledgement of the audience's appreciation. The gesture made the applause grow even louder. Someone whistled again. A man's voice called out, "More! Play more!" But Isabella couldn't. She'd given everything she had. Her hands were shaking, her legs felt like water, and suddenly, the full weight of what she'd just done came crashing down on her. She'd stepped out of invisibility in the most public way possible. There was no taking this back. No returning to being the quiet waitress nobody noticed. She'd been seen, really seen, and the world hadn't ended. In fact, it had opened up in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. The applause finally began to taper off as people returned to their seats, while many continued to look at her with expressions of amazement. Conversations erupted immediately, everyone wanting to talk about what they'd just witnessed. The energy in the restaurant had completely transformed. This retirement party had become something else. A story people would tell. You should have been there. The waitress played piano, and it was incredible. Richard Hartwell was moving through the tables, heading toward the piano, toward her. Isabella's heart, which had just started to slow down, kicked back into high gear. He walked with purpose, his face serious, but not unkind. When he reached her, he extended his hand. "That was extraordinary," he said simply. Isabella shook his hand, her palms sweaty, hoping he wouldn't notice. "Thank you. I'm sorry if I disrupted your party." "I just disrupted." He actually laughed. "Young lady, you just gave everyone here something they'll remember for the rest of their lives, including me. And believe me, at my age, memorable moments are precious." He paused, his expression becoming more serious. "May I ask your name?" "Isabella." "Isabella Chen." "Isabella Chen," he repeated, as if testing how it sounded. "And how long have you been playing piano?" "Since I was 7. But I haven't performed in a long time. Why not?" The question was direct, but not accusatory. Genuinely curious, Isabella felt her throat tighten. Life got complicated. I had to make choices. Music became something I used to do. Hartwell nodded slowly, as if this made perfect sense to him, as if he'd seen this story play out before. What did you study? Where did you train? Mostly with a private teacher. I was accepted to Hartwell Music Academy on scholarship, actually, but I couldn't attend. Something flickered across his face. Hartwell Academy. My father founded that school. Of course he did. Of course, this was that Hartwell. Isabella felt dizzy suddenly. The coincidence almost too much. She'd been accepted to the academy founded by this man's family, had lost that opportunity, and now here she was, playing at his retirement party. The universe had a strange sense of humor. I'm going to make a phone call, Hartwell said, pulling out his phone. Would you mind staying for a few minutes after you're done with? Whatever you need to do? He glanced at her server's uniform as if just remembering she actually worked here. Yes, of course. He smiled and walked a few steps away, already dialing. Isabella stood there, her brain unable to fully process what was happening. Mr. Langley appeared at her elbow, his face flushed. Isabella? I had no idea. In 3 years, you never mentioned I know, she said quietly. I guess I didn't think it mattered anymore. Well, it matters, he said firmly. It clearly matters, he hesitated, then added, take your break. Catch your breath. Miguel and Rita can cover your section. Isabella nodded mutely and made her way toward the back patio where she usually spent her breaks. But this time, several people stopped her along the way. The woman in the silver dress touched her arm gently. Thank you, she whispered. My mother used to play that Chopin piece. She passed away last year. It was like hearing her again. The older gentleman with the cane caught her hand briefly. Never stop playing, young lady. The world needs beauty. By the time Isabella reached the patio, her eyes were blurring with tears. She sat on the old wooden bench and let them fall. Relief, joy, terror, grief for the years she'd lost, hope for what might come next. All of it mixed together until she couldn't tell one emotion from another. Through the door, she could hear the party resuming inside. Normal sounds, laughter, clinking glasses. But nothing would be normal again. Isabella Chen had been invisible for 3 years, and in 25 minutes at a piano, she'd become unforgettable. Isabella sat on the patio bench for 15 minutes, letting the cool evening air calm her racing heart. Inside, the party had resumed its course. She could hear the muffled sounds of celebration laughter, the clink of glasses, conversations flowing freely again. But the energy had shifted. There was a lightness to the voices now, a warmth that hadn't been there before Vincent's disaster. Somehow, the near catastrophe followed by her unexpected performance had turned the evening into something special rather than ruined. Miguel found her first. He stepped onto the patio carrying 2 glasses of water and handed her one without saying anything. He sat beside her on the bench, his usually joking demeanor quiet and serious. You never told us, he said finally. I know. Isabella took a sip of water, considering the question. Why hadn't she mentioned it? It wasn't like anyone had specifically asked if she had hidden talents, but there was more to it than that. Because telling people means they expect things from you. And I was already failing at enough without adding piano to the list. Miguel nodded slowly. I get that. I used to want to be a writer. Wrote every day in high school. My English teacher said I had real talent. He paused. Then I got married young. Had kids, needed stable work. Writing became something I used to do. Something that felt like giving up every time I thought about it. So I stopped thinking about it. I sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Isabella hadn't known that about Miguel. 3 years of working together, countless shifts side by side, and she'd never known he carried his own abandoned dream. Maybe everyone did. Maybe the world was full of people who'd had to choose survival over passion. You were incredible in there, Miguel said. Like, truly incredible. I had no idea music could do that to people. There was this moment where everyone just ... stopped, like you'd cast a spell. It didn't feel like me doing it, Isabella admitted. It felt like the music was just happening through me. Does that sound crazy? No, it sounds exactly right. Rita appeared in the doorway, her eyes bright. Isabella? Mr. Hartwell is asking for you. He's been talking on his phone for the last 10 minutes, and now he wants to speak with you. Isabella's stomach flipped. She stood, handed her water glass back to Miguel, and smoothed down her uniform. She caught her reflection in the patio door hair, slightly messy from running her hands through it. Face flushed, eyes still a bit red from crying. She looked like someone who'd just experienced something life-changing, which she supposed she had. Richard Hartwell was standing near the piano, speaking with Mr. Langley and two other men Isabella didn't recognize. When he saw her approaching, he excused himself and walked to meet her halfway. "Isabella," he said warmly, "thank you for waiting. I've just had a very interesting conversation with someone I'd like you to meet." He gestured to one of the men he'd been speaking with, a slender guy in his 50s, with wire-rimmed glasses and an air of quiet authority. "This is David Brennan. He's the artistic director of the City Symphony Orchestra." The world tilted slightly. Isabella shook David's hand, trying not to let her shock show. The City Symphony Orchestra was one of the most prestigious in the region. She dreamed of playing with them once, back when she'd had permission to dream. "That was quite a performance," David said, his voice measured but kind. "Richard called me specifically to come over here. Said I had to meet you in person. He doesn't usually exaggerate, so I came immediately." He paused. He wasn't exaggerating. "Thank you," Isabella managed. "That's very kind. Richard tells me you were accepted to Hartwell Academy?" "Years ago, yes. I couldn't attend. And yet you've clearly continued developing your skill. Who did you study with?" Isabella's mind went blank. Study. She hadn't studied with anyone. She'd survived. She'd worked double shifts and paid medical bills and tried not to think about piano too much because it hurt too much. I didn't, not formally. I just practiced when I could, played for myself." David and Richard exchanged a look that Isabella couldn't quite interpret. David pulled out his phone and typed something quickly. "I'd like you to audition for us. We have an opening in our piano section. One of our pianists is going on maternity leave in 2 months. It's a temporary position initially, 6 months, but it could become permanent based on performance." Isabella stared at him. An audition. With the city's symphony orchestra. The words didn't seem real. "I know this is sudden," David continued, "and I understand you may need time to prepare. But Richard has convinced me that you have something special, and from what I heard tonight, I agree. Raw talent like yours doesn't come along often." He held out a business card. "Call my office on Monday. We'll schedule something for 2 weeks from now. That should give you enough time to prepare a few pieces. Nothing too elaborate. We just want to see your range and technique under more formal circumstances." Isabella took the card with shaking fingers. The paper felt impossibly heavy, like it carried the weight of every choice she'd made and every dream she'd given up. "I should mention," David added, "the position comes with a stipend. Not enough to make you rich, but enough to live on. And orchestra members have access to practice facilities and, if needed, additional training opportunities." He smiled slightly. "Something tells me you'd make good use of those." I don't know what to say." "Say you'll call on Monday," Richard interjected gently. "I'll call on Monday," Isabella repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. David nodded and excused himself, heading back toward the party. Richard stayed, studying Isabella with those sharp eyes that seemed to see everything. "My father founded Hartwell Academy because he believed everyone deserves a chance to develop their gifts. Not just the wealthy. Not just the privileged, everyone. He used to say that talent is everywhere, but opportunity isn't." "I appreciate this," Isabella said. "More than you know. But I need to be honest, I'm terrified. I haven't performed seriously in a decade. What if I audition and fail? What if I'm not as good as you think I am?" Richard smiled. "What if you are? What if you're exactly as good as I think you are, and this is the moment your life changes? Fear is natural, but letting fear make your decisions for you. That's how people end up old and full of regrets." He paused. "I'm retiring today. 62 years old, very successful career, comfortable life. But you want to know my biggest regret? I spent too many years doing what seemed practical instead of what I actually cared about. Made a lot of money. Impressed a lot of people. But I wasn't happy until I started actually funding the things I believed in. Don't wait until you're 62 to figure that out. Isabella felt tears threatening again. Thank you for calling David, for giving me this chance. I didn't give you anything. You did that yourself when you had the courage to sit at that piano. He reached into his pocket and pulled out another card. This one's mine. If you need anything, a reference, advice, help navigating the music world, call me. I'm retired now, which means I finally have time to do things that actually matter. After Richard returned to his party, Isabella stood alone near the piano, holding 2 business cards that might change her entire life. Mr. Langley approached cautiously, as if afraid she might bolt. Isabella, I want to apologize, he said. 3 years, and I never really knew you. Never asked about your life outside this restaurant. That's on me. You're running a business. You don't need to know everyone's history. Maybe not. But I should have seen you as more than just a reliable employee. He paused. Which brings me to something I'd like to offer. You're welcome to stay on here as long as you need to, obviously. But I'd also like to offer you a different position. Weekend pianist. Friday and Saturday nights. Triple your current pay, and you'd only work those 2 evenings. It would give you time to practice, to prepare for your audition, and still pay your bills. Isabella's eyes widened. Are you serious? Completely. What happened tonight was good for business. You should see how many people are already asking when you'll play again. But more than that, it's the right thing to do. I can't give you back the years you spent just waiting tables here, but I can help you move forward. Yes, Isabella said immediately. Yes, I'd love that. Thank you. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Isabella returned to her section, but she couldn't focus on work. Guests kept stopping her, complimenting her performance, asking about her training. The woman in the silver dress gave her a hug before leaving. The older gentleman with the cane pressed a $20 bill into her hand, whispering, "For your music education fund." When the party finally ended and the last guests filtered out, Isabella helped with cleanup on autopilot. Her mind was elsewhere, spinning with possibilities and terror in equal measure. An audition with the City Symphony Orchestra. A new position as the restaurant's pianist. Business cards from influential people who believed in her. It was too much. Too fast. Too overwhelming. But also somehow exactly right. Rita caught her by the arm before she left. You're going to do it, right? The audition. I have to, Isabella said. I think if I don't, I'll regret it forever. Good, because you're incredible. And the world deserves to hear you play. Isabella walked home that night under a sky full of stars, still wearing her server's uniform, still smelling faintly of the restaurant's kitchen. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. She wasn't the invisible waitress anymore. She wasn't the girl who'd given up on her dreams. She was Isabella Chen, pianist, and for the first time in 10 years, she had permission to hope. She called her mother as soon as she got home, even though it was late. Her mother answered on the second ring, voice groggy. Mia, what's wrong? Nothing's wrong, Mama. Something's right. Something's finally right. And then Isabella told her everything Vincent's disaster. The empty piano, her decision to play, the standing ovation, the audition, all of it spilling out in a rush of words and tears and laughter. Her mother cried too. Happy tears this time. I knew you'd find your way back to music, she said. I always knew. Music like yours doesn't just disappear. It waits. I was so scared. Mama, I know. But you did it anyway. That's what courage is. Over the next 2 weeks, Isabella practiced like her life depended on it. Because in a way it did. Not her survival, she'd proven she could survive anything. But her ability to truly live, to be fully herself, to step into the person she was meant to be. That depended on this. Mr. Langley gave her access to the restaurant during offers. So she practiced on the grand piano in the empty dining room. Miguel would sometimes come by during her practice sessions, sitting quietly at a table and working on the novel he'd started writing again. Rita brought her coffee and snacks, refusing to let her forget to eat. The audition itself was both terrifying and exhilarating. Isabella played Rachmaninoff, Chopin, and a contemporary piece by a living composer. The panel listened without expression, taking notes, asking her to repeat certain sections. She left the audition room with no idea whether she'd succeeded or failed. 3 days later, David Brennan called. She'd gotten the position. 6 months later, Gela Chen performed her first concert as an official member of the city's symphony orchestra. Her mother flew in from Arizona, sitting in the front row with Mrs. Rodriguez, who'd made the trip despite her arthritis. Richard Hartwell was there too, along with most of the staff from the Riverside Garden. Miguel brought his wife and showed her the first chapter of his novel. Rita had just gotten accepted to medical school as Isabella walked onto the stage in her concert black. As the audience applauded before she'd played a single note, she thought about the girl she'd been just 6 months ago, invisible, afraid, convinced her story was over. And then she thought about Saturday night at the restaurant. The moment she'd untied her apron and walked toward that piano. The moment she'd decided to be seen. Sometimes the most extraordinary transformations begin with a single choice. A moment of courage that cracks open a door you thought was locked forever. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, a whole room full of people stands up to applaud when you finally step through. Isabella sat at the piano, adjusted her position, and let her hands rest on the keys. The concert hall fell silent. And then, taking a deep breath, she began to play.